everybody, welcome back. In this session, we're going to look at what supports teachers might need in order to be successful in including students with disabilities. Now, for those of you who can notice subtle differences or not so subtle differences, you might note that we look a little bit different from one section to another. This isn't to confuse you, it's because we recorded certain things at different times. So you'll notice that, for example, there are haircut changes, post-COVID and pre-COVID. And even my hair's gotten just a little bit longer.
Okay, we thought we'd start by telling you about how this workshop came about. For years, Emma and I have been doing workshops and keynotes on the value of inclusive education. And over, teachers kept coming up to us and saying, look, I believe in the ideals of inclusive education, but I, as a teacher, need support. And we always had a yes-no response to this because, of course, teachers need support. Because teachers don't have support, inclusion becomes dump and hope. So, of course, teachers need support. But, on the other hand, some teachers, by support, they meant, I want a full-time classroom aide with this kid in the corner of the room with room dividers around him. And that's not the type of support that promotes inclusion. So our question was, how do you provide support that still fosters inclusion? So what we did is we started to travel around and interview many of the people we knew who had successful inclusion programs going on with their schools and asked them what they did. The other thing we did is we looked back on my life, back on Emma's life, and said, what supports would have been most helpful for teachers and for us as students when we were in a regular class? So that we took those two bodies of information, we combined them, and thus we ended up with this workshop. This is a great job. Teachers tell us what to tell you and we get paid. Anyway, now, one thing to add is that when we talk to teachers, over and over, we heard the same two things. The first thing we heard was that teachers who have more experience with inclusion have very different ideas on what support was most helpful than those teachers who were new to inclusion. The second common thing we found among the teachers we talked to was that they said the support that they found to be most helpful was very different from the support that they thought they initially needed. So we're going to talk about these two issues through this presentation. So let's start. So all the teachers more or less agreed that there were 6 general areas where they needed support: information, collaborative planning, shared agreement on goals and expectations, classroom and school-based supports, classroom assistance, and administrative supports. We're going to focus on the first 5 because the last one will give you bullet points of what type of administrative support teachers needed, but that one is self-explanatory. So let's begin. Let's start off with information. Now this is the first big difference that we found with teachers who were new to inclusion and those teachers who were more experienced with inclusion. The teachers who were new to inclusion wanted information about the disability, but those teachers who had more experience with inclusion wanted information about the student. And here's why. This is a visual representation that we did around the work of Dembo, Leviton, and Wright from their work at the University of Kansas around the disability spread. If I had to describe myself, I could describe myself as the circle. I'm a white male Canadian who comes from a specific cultural background and economic class. I went to a segregated school and then went on to a regular school. I did an undergraduate degree, a master's degree. I'm married. We have 2 grown kids. Each have a partner. I like chess, jazz, Greek food. I have the strange ability to memorize phone numbers, and I happen to have cerebral palsy. But the cerebral palsy is one small part of who I am as a person. However, when people first meet me or they hear me speak, they often make assumptions about who I am as a person and what my life is like based on my disability. So one way of understanding this is that disability starts to spread, and it casts a shadow over who I am and what my life is like, much like a shadow is cast over a sundial in the afternoon light. So it could be said that people see me as 9/10 disability and 1/10 person. However, as people get to know me, or after they've heard me speak for 5 or 10 minutes, they get more interested in who I am as a person and what my ideas are, and the disability, as it were, starts to shrink. And this same process will likely take place when you have a disabled kid in your class or program. When that kid initially enters your room, the disability will likely be the most prominent attribute that you see in the kid. And everything you do or understand about this child will be seen through the lens of disability. However, as you get to know the kid, what you'll find is you'll get more interested in who this child is, what his interests are, and his disability will begin to shrink and become less prominent in how you define the child. I need to tell you a funny story. A number of years ago, Emma and I were doing a presentation in Chicago, and during a day-long presentation, we used the disability spread, and when we looked at the evaluations at the end of the day, one person had written down, "I really like the concept of the disability spread," and Norman was right. By the end of the day, I really saw him as being 9/10 human. Missed it by that much. However, let's go on. Now, all the teachers also agreed that they needed information about the disability. But here is another way where the teachers who have more experience with inclusion were different from those teachers who were new to inclusion. Those teachers who were new to inclusion went primarily to experts or the literature to find out about disability. They went to journal articles, they consulted with district professionals, etc. However, many of those teachers who have more experience with inclusion, when they wanted to learn about the disability, they went to either the student, the family, to find out the necessary, relevant, specific information that applied to that particular student. So one of the ways of understanding this is those teachers with more experience with inclusion trusted experience over expertise. And here's what I mean by that. When you want information about the kid, it's important to figure out who spends the most time with that kid. So the person who spends the most time with the kid is the kid, because the kid is always with the kid. Now, the next group of people who spend time with the kid is their family and their friends, and then they connect their professionals, and they call the consulting professionals. So as you move out from the circle, a way to conceptualize this is the amount of experience you have with that student or child diminishes. But the problem is in our society, our school system, and in our professional idea of who has relevant information, we believe that as you move out from the middle of the circle, your expertise gets greater. And you can never have expertise on a child. You can only have expertise on a disability. Because expertise always rests on generalizations about the disability, whereas experience relies on the specific, particular information about the kid. So going back to the keynote, this is like looking for the keys in the part of the street that's not necessarily lighted by the street lamp. Conventional wisdom says we have to look under the street lamp. It says the only people with relevant information are the people who spend the most time at university. And what we're saying, people with disabilities and their families, and sometimes even their friends, have information that the most well-meaning professionals won't have. Now, by no means am I minimizing the importance of expertise. What you've learned in your education, in university, in your training is relevant. All I'm saying is that needs to be balanced. There's many things that you know as a professional that can benefit that disabled kid. But there's other information that that child, their family, and their friends know that can equally contribute to that child's education and well-being. So don't presume that your knowledge that you learned from a program or university supersedes the particular information that a student, their family, or a child may have. And this makes your life a whole lot easier. Because when I talk to teachers and preschool educators, etc., what they often tell me is there's such enormous stress that they feel because they have to come up with all the answers. They have to think that I have to solve every problem that a disabled kid presents in my class. And sometimes I think they feel like a special ed psychic. They have to look at the crystal ball and go, aha, I know how to solve that problem, when in reality they don't. So, like Emma said in the keynote, by focusing on questions rather than focusing on answers, that will make your life a whole lot easier. Now let me give you an example of the importance of asking questions rather than giving answers. Many people come up to me and say, okay, look, you're a disabled person. If you were supporting a disabled student, what would you do? And I invariably say I would ask the following question. I would say, how can I help you? What can I do to support you? And the kid would likely say, I don't know. My next question would be, well, what would you say if you did know? Because very often when you ask a child, what can I do to help you, they feel pressured to give you the right answer. Whereas if you say, what would you say if you did know, you give the kid the permission to simply offer their opinion. Now that kid may say, I still don't know. In that case, I would try to act like a waiter in a restaurant. I would offer the kid a menu. I would do this, I could do this, I could do this, or I could do this. What do you think would be most helpful? I would trust the kid to guide me into which supports would be most important. The reason I would do this is because as a disabled person, I know the most important attribute that contributed to my successful inclusion into school, the workplace, and community in general was my ability to initiate the support I needed. I didn't wait for other people to make recommendations. I would look at the situation and figure out what made sense for me and then suggest it. Let me give you an example. In grade 11, I walked into my math class on the first day. I could tell the teacher was terrified. He went, oh my God, this kid has to do calculus and algebra and functions on a typewriter. How is he going to do all those mathematical codes on typewriter? Well, to be honest, I let him sweat for the whole first period. And then, at the end of the period, I would tell me which symbols we're going to need throughout the year. And like most math books, they have a glossary of symbols at the back of the book. So I just marked them off. I went home that night and I figured out an efficient and easy way for me to do mathematical symbols on an electric typewriter. I'm giving away my age, because this is before computers. This is in the time of Smith Corona electric typewriters with the little ribbon. And so I figured out a very efficient way to do symbols. For example, GTE represented greater to or equal than. A red number to the 2 represented a square or to the power of 2 or 3. I then typed out a complete code walked into my math teacher the next day and said, here's the code. You follow that, we'll be fine. You could see both the relief and the surprise on his face, because he thought he would have to come up with a solution. But I took the initiative, and that was important. And apart from that, I already do. I automatically had a B in the class, because when students take initiative, you're already a B, and whatever you do after that just improves your grade. But this is an example of why it's important to have students develop the ability to initiate the support we need.
One of the reasons this is important was illustrated for us when we met with a group of counselors who were helping kids with disabilities enter post-secondary education. And they said to us, we've got some good news for you and we've got some bad news. The good news is that there are far more students with disabilities entering post-secondary education these days. The bad news is that they come in really, really dependent, almost like a learned helplessness. And so they were trying to think about why that might be. And we think one of the reasons for that is that we have over-supported, and that doesn't mean we under-support either, but sometimes we have actually contributed to that learned helplessness by doing everything for the student, rather than helping them to develop the capacity they need to initiate that support.
So questions are far, far more useful than providing answers. But you know what? Even though this makes perfect sense to us and may make sense to you, what we find is that many professionals believe that they could just go away and do stuff in their own way, that would make life easier. And we found a cartoon that we think represents us. It says, mind your own business. This is how I like it.
We want to look at the next step, which is collaborative planning. A number of years ago, we were at a conference and in a workshop where a teacher was talking about inclusive education. And she said, I used to come to conferences like this and I used to get really frustrated because every time I wanted to know how best to support a child with a disability, I was told that the most important thing was collaboration. So I heard it over and over and over again. Collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And she said, I just used to want to stand up and say, don't tell me to collaborate, just tell me what to do on Monday. And then she said, and now, here I am up in front of you doing this workshop, and I'm going to tell you that the most important thing to providing success in inclusive education is to collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. She said, we think that what we want is a recipe. We just want to know what to do on Monday. Give me the 5-step model. How am I going to get this thing done, etc. But she says what we really need is a pantry. We need a lot of ideas. We need a lot of people to collaborate with. She said, when I was getting ready to come and do this workshop, I had this box of all these strategies, all these worksheets, etc., that I thought I would bring for you. And all around the room, you could see teachers getting kind of excited. Oh, give me some worksheets. That's awesome. And she said, but I didn't bring them. Because you know what? When it comes right down to it, your students, the children you support, are going to be different than the children I support. The place in which you support them is going to be different than the place in which I support my students. So what I have done may or may not have any relevance to what you need to do. So, what we like to say is that we need to utilize the creative problem-solving experience of the student and the family, and we really cannot say that enough. Norm's already said this, but I really want to reiterate this because it's probably the most important piece.
One of the best stories that we heard that illustrates this, and really a wonderful strategy, came to us from a doctoral student in Madison, Wisconsin named Josh. Josh was a 10th grade math teacher, and he told us that at the beginning of the school year, usually on a Monday, he would say to his students, on Friday, I am going to give you a 1,000,000-word essay. And the students would all go, oh, a 1,000,000-word essay, really? And he would say, yeah, just wait for it. So on Friday, he would hand out this piece of paper and he would give it to his students and say, here's your 1,000,000-word essay, but here's the good news. It's not for you, it's for your parents. And on that piece of paper, it said, in 1,000,000 words or less, tell me what I need to know about your son or daughter, and tell me what I can do to help support them. He got back an amazing amount of information. He said, and even when I didn't get stuff back, that was information that I could follow up on. Now, I got to tell you, we told this story in Vancouver to a group of superintendents and principals. And about a week later, my sister was babysitting her grandchildren. And she said to me, I got the weirdest thing at home. She said it was a piece of paper and it said, in 1,000,000 words or less, tell me how I can support your child. And she said it was just a wonderful, wonderful exercise. And so did Janina's parents. Asking those questions can build trust between teachers, professionals, and parents and families, and also with the child themselves. So what's the dream and what's the vision? This is a question we ask of non-disabled kids all the time. What do you want to be when you grow up? Where do you think you'll go? But we don't ask disabled kids this question very often, and we don't ask their families. Norm and I have both been in meetings where families and parents have burst into tears upon being asked this question because they'd never been asked it before. They'd never been asked to think more broadly about what the future might hold for their child. And you know that old saying about if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. So we need to have some kind of a dream and some kind of a vision for where we want to go. Toni Morrison said, as you enter positions of trust and power, dream a little before you think. Just to give you an example, how many of you know who Evelyn Glenny is? Well, for those of you who don't, Evelyn Glenny is a world-renowned percussionist. She's had pieces of music written for her by famous people from all over the world. She's done virtuoso performances everywhere. Norm and I had the privilege of seeing her perform in Vancouver a number of years ago. What you might not know, looking at this picture of Evelyn Glenny, is that she is profoundly deaf. Now, I understand a little bit about how deaf people can play music because of what my deaf friends have told me. I understand a bit about how sound travels through objects and through the floor, etc. So I could understand Evelyn Glenny playing the timpani, for example, a big, robust, full-bodied drum. But here's the thing. We watched a documentary a number of years ago about Evelyn Glenny, and she was in her studio in Scotland, and she was carrying the sticks in her hand, much in the way that she is in this picture, and she was walking through her studio, lightly tapping on cymbals, and she went, ding, ding. No, that one has too much sizzle. Now I get how sound moves through objects, but how does she know which of those tiny little cymbals has too much or not enough sizzle? Hold that thought for a moment. How many of you know who this is? Well, yeah, it says underneath his name that this is Danny Delcombre, and indeed it is. Now, for those of you who are foodies, Danny Delcombre is a chef, and he studied under the great Paul Prudhomme, and he, for many years, had a very high-end restaurant in Seattle called the Ragin' Cajun, where a number of dignitaries like Oprah, etc., ate. And later on, he ran a Chi-Chi catering company, and these days he does some speaking and talks about his situation. Now, what you would not know by looking at Danny Delcombre is that he is also deaf. Now, I'm sure I know what you're thinking. I get how a deaf person can be a cook. But here's the other thing. He's also legally blind. And that's a little harder for us to understand. How does a person who is both deaf and blind actually manage to run a really busy restaurant kitchen? But despite what we might think, that's exactly what he does. Now, I think it is a really good thing that I was not part of either Evelyn or Danny's transition planning committees as they were planning to leave high school, because I wonder if I would have had the imagination or the ability to support a dream like that. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, that's all very well and fine for people like Evelyn and Danny who are very talented. But what about some of the kids that we support who have intellectual disabilities, etc.? Well, let me give you one final story. This came to us from our friend Judith Snow. Judith is a woman who had a very significant disability. In fact, she was only able to use 2 fingers of one hand. But Judith had grown up in a world that wasn't set up for her, and as a result, she was a master at lateral thinking. Now, Judith was asked to facilitate a meeting for a young man named John who was leaving high school. John had an intellectual disability. Now, she sat down with John and she said, "What would you like to do when you leave school?" And John said, "I want to be an astronaut." Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I had heard that, my heart would probably have sunk to my boots. Because, let's face it, there's probably about 12 people in the world who are astronauts, and most of them have 3 PhDs. What are the odds of this young man becoming an astronaut? So, again, I'm not sure I would have been able to support John in this. I might have done what some of the rest of us might have done. And that would be, if you've got good social skills, you lean forward and you say, "Wow, that's great. What else?" Desperately hoping that there is a what else. Now, Judith, because of her experience with disability, was just not that easily deterred. So she said, "Okay, well, what do you think you'd need to know in order to be an astronaut?" And he said, "Well, I guess you'd need to know some things about outer space, and you'd need to know some things about spaceships." And she said, "Well, where do you think you could get that information?" So to make a long story a bit shorter, they went to the planetarium. They were early for the show. So as they were walking around in the lobby, the manager came out and struck up a conversation with them, and they told him why they were there. And he said, "Well, that's really interesting, but I could really use some volunteer ushers, and it could lead into a paying job. Do you think you might be interested, John?" So if you'd gone to the planetarium a number of years ago before it inexplicably closed in Toronto, you would have seen John. He'd have been the guy showing you to your seat, wearing the NASA spacesuit. Now, I really hope you're not thinking, "Oh, isn't that adorable? The young man with an intellectual disability thinks he's an astronaut." No. John knew he wasn't an astronaut. And you know what he said? He said, "I still want to be an astronaut, but right now, this is really cool." So we have to be really careful not to jump on people's dreams. One of the things that Norm and I talk about a lot is that being realistic is not necessarily realistic, and that we think when we're trying to help people come to terms with the realism of the disability that we're doing a good thing. But we might, in fact, be actually stomping on someone's dreams. Now, I have a role model in here, and my role model is Socrates. And this is a recent picture, you can tell. So, I don't know how many of you know what Socrates did, but I'm sure you all know that he was a philosopher. And he used to go out into the agora, which is the marketplace in Rome at that time. And he would gather people around him, and he would challenge them to think about the big ideas in the world. So he would say, "What is beauty and what is truth?" And then he would suggest that they go away and debate these things until they came up with a definition and then come back and present it to him. And that's exactly what they did. So these acolytes of Socrates would go away and come back and give him their definition. And invariably, Socrates would do the same thing. He would say, "I don't think so, and here's why." And then he would decimate all of their well-constructed arguments. Now me, I've always had a bit of a visual brain, and I had this idea of those poor students of Socrates lying on the floor like demoralized puddles, and then standing up as any of the rest of us would do, putting their hands on their hips and saying, "All right, you think you're so smart? then what is beauty? What is justice? What is truth? And Socrates would smile and invariably say the same thing. He would say, I don't know, but at least I know that I don't know. When we're working with people, this is only ever as good as it gets. I'm thinking we ought to all take a Hippocratic oath that says we will never, never overstep someone's dreams, and we will always pay attention to what's possible, because we absolutely don't know. What we're learning from people we have thought were absolutely unable to understand things, from a lot of autistic people who are non-speaking, and you will notice I do not use the words nonverbal. There's no such thing. Everyone communicates in some way. But non-speaking people who find themselves in this strange existential moment of suddenly having gained a communication system, and then everyone around them starts to listen to them. But before that, nobody supported their dreams or their aspirations. And this is a terrible thing. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to join with me for a moment and look at this. Say this with me. I don't know. Is that? But I'm willing to work with you on figuring this out. For any of us, this is as good as it gets. We do not know what people are capable of.
So under collaborative planning, the third point is utilize planning models, and there's a variety of them. Maps, paths, the homecoming model, matrix, coach, etc. We're going to just focus on one of them, specifically what we call the curriculum matrix. So here's a very simple planning model. What it is a simple table where you have the subjects put along the top row and the goals, the particular goals for that student down the left column. So for example, this is actually a curriculum matrix for a young girl that I worked with in Fort St. John, BC, who is going from a grade 9 into grade 10 regular high school. Now for Holly, the subjects that she was going to be taking in her first semester were English, phys ed, lunch, obviously drama, and she has spare. We sat down with the family, her friends, her former teachers, and we agreed on which goal should take priority. And we agreed there were 4 primary goals: reading, risk-taking, stretching, and socializing. So once we had this built in the table, we had this structure that we could do brainstorming. So we started off with English and said, how can we meet the goal of reading in English? Some of Holly's friends said, look, we're interested in becoming teachers. How about if we spend the first 10 or 15 minutes of each English class and teach her how to read the words that are important to her? The teacher said, yeah, that would be great. Risk-taking. The teacher said, that's easy. I'll make sure that Holly asks or answers at least one question in every class. Stretching. Stretching is not appropriate in English, so we skipped it. Remember, you don't have to meet every goal in every class. Socializing. Teacher said, well, we and the students can encourage Holly to participate in group work. So in 45 minutes, we had the entire matrix filled out. Now, the teachers in Maple Ridge, British Columbia came up with a brilliant addition to this. They looked at this table and said, you know what? If we put another column on the right side, we'll have room for goal evaluation. And if we add a row along the bottom for subject evaluation, then what we have is an IEP on one piece of paper. Now, we've shown this to a lot of teachers, and many teachers get excited. However, some elementary school teachers say, that's okay, but we're high school teachers. They only have to worry about one column. The problem for us is we have to worry about the entire sheet. But elementary teachers told us, no, that's not true. Once you have the matrix, you can work with the family, the student. You can identify which goals to have priority, work on those first, and once they get incorporated in the regular routine of the day, then you can pick up other goals.
Sometimes we get asked about goal evaluation, and teachers say, well, how do I evaluate a student that may not be keeping up with the curriculum that the other students are working on to make it fair? Now, we aren't experts on evaluation, but one of the ways that we've had of understanding this is to take a page from employment and equity legislation. And what we know from employment equity is that treating people equally doesn't necessarily mean treating people the same. Just to give you an example of this, let's suppose you go to a conference, a real conference, not a virtual conference. What usually happens at the breaks? Well, at the breaks, everyone gets up and goes to the washroom, right? Wrong. Men get up and go to the washroom, women get up and line up. Why is that? Because somehow when those buildings were built, they were predicated on an idea that treating people equally meant treating people the same. So in the allocation of washroom space, equal space was allocated for men and for women. Now, is that treating people the same? Yes. But is it treating people equally? Not really, because our needs are different. So nowadays, when they're designing buildings with washrooms for women that are probably about a quarter to a third bigger than washrooms for men, understanding that what we're striving for is equal impact. So in the same way, when we're looking at goal evaluation for the students that we're teaching, we're looking for equal impact. This might mean that we give students accommodations for their learning styles, for the time it takes them to do things. This doesn't mean that we're treating people unfairly or disadvantaging other students. We're just working to create a situation of equal impact.
So many teachers ask us, I have a certain curriculum to teach. I have numerous activities to get that curriculum across to my students. Now that I have a student in my class who cannot meet that curriculum, do I have to create a number of parallel activities to meet that student's individual education goals? Now, our friend and colleague Jill England addressed this. She's a professor of education at Michigan State University, and her idea was no. What you have to do is, rather than start from the curriculum, start from the activity. And here's what she means by this. Let's suppose you're a grade 5 teacher and you're teaching a math class involving multiplying through two groups of 3-digit numbers together. Then you want your students to find the product for. Now, what happens if you have a student like me who can cognitively keep up with the curriculum but physically can't write down the answers or the calculation quick enough? Well, that's a fairly simple answer. I can either do every other question I can complete 2 questions out full to demonstrate I know how to do it, and then do the remaining questions in short form. Teachers say, yeah, that's easy. But what happens if I have a student who cannot keep up with that curriculum, if they're working on independent educational goals? And Joe says, again, that's easy, but the key is to start from the activity. Take that same worksheet and say, okay, I want the student to add the numbers. Or if the student isn't able to add, perhaps they take each of the 6 numbers in those questions and order them from smallest to largest. Or if they can't do that, perhaps what they do is they look through the worksheet and identify how many 1s there are, how many 2s there are, how many 3s there are. What this does is it shows us that you can take a single worksheet and make it applicable to a wide range of curriculum. But the key is to begin from the activity, not from the curriculum. But Joe said this not only has advantages for students with independent educational goals, it also has advantages for those students who may already know how to do that curriculum, complete the worksheet in 5 minutes, and spend the remaining time bugging other students. Because what you do is you give them the spreadsheet and say, okay, once you find the product, Josh and Jason, you square it. So again, for as many of you know, the obvious name for this is differentiated instruction.
All right, next thing, do not anticipate problems. So one of the differences between teachers who are new to inclusion and those who have more experience came to us from a teacher who had a lot of experience, and she said, don't anticipate problems, because the problem that you think you're going to need to solve is very seldom the problem that you will have to solve. She said, save yourself the bottle of Jack Daniels and just deal with problems as they come up. Now, the way in which we've conceptualized this is like this rope. When Norm and I first met, he was an avid sailor. I've never been a sailor, but I was really interested in trying. So for any of you who are sailors, you probably know that when you're moving along at a good clip, one of the things that happens is a lot of rope, and don't call it that, call it line, because otherwise you'll embarrass yourself to your sailing friends. A lot of line will collect in the cockpit, and it becomes a tripping hazard. So the first couple of times this happened, Norm would say to me, could you please loop up that line and cleat it? So I would dive in enthusiastically and try to do that. And invariably, I would make it even worse, and we would have more knots. So one day, Norm said to me very tactfully, he said, you know, honey, there's an easier way to do that. Find the end of the rope, untie the first knot, then the second knot, then the third knot, and the rope will untangle itself. I've often thought that this is a really good analogy for the work that we're trying to do. When you look at the whole process of supporting a kid with a disability, it can look like a whole snarled mess of rope. But one way to make it manageable is to find the end of that rope, untie the first knot and the second knot, and the rope will untangle itself. It's only ever one knot at a time. Kind of like when you move, you know that moment when you move and you have a million boxes sitting in your living room and all your friends have gone home and the pizza's finished and the beer's gone, and you go, kill me now. I don't know where to start. What you have to do is you go to the first box and you unpack it, and the next box and the next box. Now that said, we do need some crisis procedures or mechanisms for when things go a little astray, because thinking ahead allows us to be less reactive. So we like to think about crisis procedures as runaway lanes. Now, how many of you know what a runaway lane is? And I'm asking that for a reason, because we did this workshop once in Nebraska and nobody knew what a runaway lane is, but I'm thinking that those of you in California probably do know what it is. A runaway lane, of course, is that lane on a very steep highway that allows a big truck, when they've lost their brakes, to come to a safe stop. How do we provide a safe space to come to a stop when things are problematic? Here's a story for you. This is our friend Rich Villa, also lives in California, and this is Scott. When we first met Scott, he was part of a panel of kids talking about their experiences in an inclusive school. Scott, by his own admission, had been a difficult kid to support. He had been catapulted out of almost every educational setting that he'd ever been in. The last time, I think, because he jumped from a height of 4 feet onto the principal's foot, breaking a number of small but important bones. He was basically failing. Now, our friend Rich, who at that time was the special education director for that school district, came to Scott and said, "Scott, what can we do to help?" There's that question, right? How can we help? Now, Scott had been around the block a little, and he wasn't ready to trust that that was a sincere question. And he said, "I don't know." And Rich persisted. And if you talk with Rich, he'll tell you, you can't just ask the question one time. You have to ask it as many times as you need to do. And that's what Rich did. So finally, Scott said, "Okay, I'll come to your meeting and I'll tell you what I need." So they got to the meeting and Rich said, "How can we help?" And Scott said, "Okay, here's what you need to know. First of all, you need to know that when I lose it, it's really awful. It's like something bubbles up in my chest and comes up through the top of my head and explodes. And I hate it. I'm embarrassed. I'm exhausted. It's awful. Here's what I need. When I feel that feeling, I need to be able to get up, go somewhere by myself or with someone that I trust, and wait for it to pass." Rich said, "That's it?" Scott said, "Yeah, that's it." So Rich went back to the teachers and said, "Here's what Scott said he needs." And the teachers said, "Well, we can't do that. How do we know all the other kids aren't going to want to do that? And how do we know he's not going to do it to get out of doing work?" And Rich said, "You know what? I know that you're frustrated, but what is our goal here? Do we want this kid to succeed?" And they all agreed. And to their credit, they said, yes, they did. So that's exactly what they did. So when we met Scott, he was working in a garage, which was something he'd always wanted to do, and he had graduated from high school. And he said, "You know, I still lose it sometimes, but now it's like I kind of know what to do about it." And as educators, as parents, as professionals, doesn't that interest you? Isn't that what we talk about when we talk about moving from an external locus of control to an internal locus of control? Scott was able to participate actively in developing the supports that were most important for him. This can happen for kids at a really, really early age. They can participate with us in thinking through what might help. I also want you to think about the difference between what Scott wanted and actually was able to put together and timeout. Timeout is a very, very different thing. Seclusion is a very different thing. We know from brain research that secluding kids against their will actually has an effect on brain patterns. And we know that we need to be very, very careful and not do this. Timeout is categorically different from finding a place where I can go to collect myself again. So what I want to do now is talk for a bit about how to support kids who exhibit what is sometimes euphemistically called challenging behavior, and put a slightly different spin on it. I talked during the keynote about Bill Page and his idea that what we need to do is understand our roles as lifeguard and swimming instructor, and not to give swimming lessons when someone is drowning. Our friend David Petoniak once said something that is emblazoned on the inside of my forehead. He said, "Trying to understand someone's behavior outside the context of their lives is fundamentally disrespectful." So let's have a look at that. First of all, do not assume a malicious intent. Stay curious. I talked a lot in the keynote about the value of questions and being curious. And we think that this is probably one of the most important things that we can do, is just to stay curious. Why is someone acting in the way that they're acting? And to also challenge our own perceptions. And there's a point of enlightened self-interest in that. Let me tell you a story that came to us from our friend Tim McConnell. Tim, for many years, was the special education director in Salt Lake City, Utah. Tim is married to Bambi and has 2 children. This story happened at the time that his youngest child, William, was about 7 years old. Bambi was driving down the road one day, and you got to know that Bambi understands quite a few things about disability issues because she's been hanging out with Tim for quite a long time. So they're driving down the road, and William's in the back seat. And from the back seat, William says, "Mom, what's a spaz?" And Bambi goes, "Oh, William, that's not a very nice thing to say. That's an insult that often gets leveled against kids with disabilities like cerebral palsy. It's not a nice thing to say." Then she launches into what we like to call 5 minutes of Disability 101 for 7-year-olds. So she explains the etiology of spasms, and she goes into the whole thing, and finally she's done. And at the end of that, she kind of looks into the back seat and she says, "Now, William, I hope you never say that." And William goes, "No, Mom." And then Bambi thinks to ask the question. She says, "By the way, where'd you hear that? Was it at school?" And William goes, "No, it was on that sign back there. It said, pools, hot tubs, and spas." Now, I told that story at another conference, and a woman put up her hand and said, "You know, I did the same thing. My 6-year-old came home from school and said, 'Mom, what's sex?' And she said, 'So I told him.'" And then he looked at her in frustration and said, "No, Mom, I got this piece of paper from the school, and it's got these little boxes that you tick off that say either M or F. Now, we won't get into the complexities of non-binary identification, but the moral of the story is clear. Ask the question first and save yourself the embarrassment." All right. The behavior usually has a communicative intent or is the result of unmet needs. Another story. This came to us from a friend in Michigan, Tom Osbeck. Tom was part of an itinerant group of teachers who were helping to place children in inclusive classrooms. And one of the kids that he was supporting was a little boy named Sam, who had just moved to Michigan from South Carolina. And he had had a pretty successful first grade experience and was moving into a second grade class. Now, what you need to know is that this little boy couldn't speak, but he was doing fine in school. So Tom dropped him off, and after a week or so, he got a call back from the teacher, and the teacher said, "Get this kid out of my classroom. He's disruptive, he throws things, he lies on the ground, he kicks, he screams. I don't know what's going on, and I can't cope." So Tom said, "Well, could I come in and just have a look at what's going on?" And she said, "Sure, but you need to understand that if this continues to go on, he's got to come out of my class." So Tom went in, and this teacher had a particular way of teaching, and it was kind of didactic, or a bit of call and response, I guess. So she would go A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. "Now, class, say 'em." And the class would repeat. But this little boy, Sam, would fall on the ground, kick and scream and throw things around. This went on for a number of times that the teacher used this same technique of teaching. It's a really good thing that Tom Osbeck is also from South Carolina, because if he hadn't been, he might not have understood what was going on. Now, I got a friend named Cindy, and she has a son named Sam, and I love to hear Cindy talk, because when she calls him, she says, "Sam." She thinks I've got the accent, but I know that she's actually got the accent. Think about this. A, E, I, O, U. Now, class, say 'em. She's calling me. She's not looking at me. I don't know what she wants. Ah! Once the teacher understood what it was that was going on and the context, she was able to change the way she taught, and the problem was that easily solved and that quickly. So probably the most important thing about thinking about disruption is the ability to listen and to intuit and to do a little detective work and to develop relationships. Probably the idea of relationship is the most important thing, and I'm sure all of you know that. But one of the things that we often hear is that creating a relationship takes a really long time. I want to counter that for a minute and tell you a story. When I was doing my master's thesis, I found a piece of research by a guy named Raymond Ludkowski called the 2x10 study, and I thought it was really pretty elegant. So I called him up and I asked him about it, and he was really surprised to hear that anyone 20 years later was still interested in this study. But it goes like this. Raymond Ludkowski went into a school and asked the teachers to pick the kid that they had the most trouble with, and for 2 minutes a day for 10 days to sit down with that student. 2 minutes a day, 10 days. Sit down with that student and just talk about anything. Find out what the student was interested in, what their lives were like. So at the end of the 10 days, he came back, and he said he expected to find that the kids had really enjoyed the one-to-one attention, and indeed they had. But what he was most surprised by was the effect that it had on the teachers. Teachers often talked about the student that they had talked to had often become a favorite in the classroom. Now, I want to give a caveat to this. While it does tell us something really, really important, and that is that relationship building doesn't need to be a big, long, and time-intensive thing. It can be much shorter than that. Relationships can be built quickly and strongly. But the caveat here is that we have to be really careful that we don't implement something like the 2x10 study and then leave it. A friend of mine who is an autistic adult and had a lot of difficulty in school said to me, this could be hugely damaging if you just go in for the 2 minutes a day, the kid thinks you care, and then you stop. So we must be really cautious in how we think about this. The reason I bring it forward is that it's an important way of understanding that relationships can be built quickly, and sometimes much more quickly than we think. The next thing we want to talk about is shared agreement on goals and expectations. First thing to understand is that the disability can't be cured. Well, obviously, you're going to say. But you would not believe how many times we've talked with teachers and other professionals who have internalized the idea that their job and their role is somehow to fix the disability. And that's a very tall order. So we talked to a teacher once who said that a parent came to her and said, here's the thing. It is September. My child has Down syndrome. I'm going to bet you serious money that he will still have Down syndrome in June. So here's what I want you to do. Teach him the way he learns. Don't try to fix him. And the teacher said it was such an important lesson. She just went, oh, it's not my job to have to do that. But we often think it is. And sometimes the structures that we work in encourage that. Even infant development programs and preschools are often about how do we make sure that the child doesn't show up looking more disabled. When we can relax and let that go and understand that there is nothing shameful about being disabled and that disability is not something that needs to be cured. We just need to find ways to work with people. All right, concentrate on functional skills, not developmental skills. In so many instances, we look at which developmental skill needs to follow which developmental skill. We need to crawl first before we walk. For those of you working with little kids, you probably know that it often doesn't go that way. But still, there's that expectation that it needs to go that way. Now, I want to tell you a little story about me. When I was first starting out in my training as a preschool teacher, I created something called the button board. Now, many of you probably are familiar with what a button board is, but if you're not, a button board is essentially a piece of plywood with cloth stapled to the back side on both sides, and then you flip it over and there's buttons and buttonholes on the other side. And the idea of the button board, of course, is to teach kids with poor fine motor control to do up buttons. So I use this thing ad infinitum. Now, when I first met Norm, he told a story that changed my view of what the button board is. First of all, he said, the button board is an instrument of torture that is used on children. And that seemed really hyperbolic to me. This innocuous little button board, what? He said, no. You got to understand that first of all, you're doing up buttons that are not on your own body. They're on a piece of board. And secondly, it's one of the only things where you get punished for succeeding. I probably looked confused. He said, think about it. When you've managed to do up the buttons, what do you get? Smaller buttons. So he told this story. He said that one day he was in the occupational therapy room and he'd used the button board and it had been used upon him. And he saw something hanging on the wall. And he said, what is that? And the occupational therapist said, why, that's a button hook. And he said, well, how does it work? And she said, well, you take it, you put it through the buttonhole, you grab the button and you pull it through the buttonhole and it does up your buttons. He said, can I try that? She said, sure. So he goes, ding, 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 does up all his buttons. And she said, wow, good for you. And he says, good for me? Why in the world have I been forced to work on a button board when something like this exists? Now, what we know, and what to my humiliation I have learned, is that we try to replicate situations in order to try to reach those developmental goals when in many instances there's no need. So one way that we like to think about this is that innovation often delivers what rehabilitation promises. I want to repeat that. Innovation delivers what rehabilitation promises. When we can become innovative, we are able to do things differently and accomplish the goals that we want to accomplish. So, expect to make mistakes, because this is a process where we're all learning and we're all trying to figure things out and we're all trying to collaborate together. Now, and this is the only time that you'll actually hear me quote the corporate sector, but in the corporate sector, they used to have a way of dealing with things that was called ready, aim, fire. We're all familiar with that. You create a product, you figure out who your constituent group is, and then you send it out. They don't do that anymore. What they do now is something called ready, fire, aim. So they think of something, they try it out, and then they flood the public with feedback forms to try to figure out whether it worked. I think we need to do the same thing. We need to try things and see what happens and ask the people that we're trying the things out on whether they have actually been effective. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen WD-40. Do you know what WD-40 stands for? I didn't. Apparently it stands for water displacement is the WD, but the 40 is the number of times that they had to work on this product to get it to actually work. And for those of you who like trivia, if you ever get a jellyfish sting, WD-40 is the very thing to try.
So the fourth category is classroom and school-based supports. So one of the things that we've talked about a lot already is utilizing students, parents, and family, getting our information from the people who know the student the best. So another underutilized resource that we have available to us is the students' classmates and friends. Let me tell you a story that illustrates this. This comes from our friend Laura, who had a daughter named Sarah, who was in about third grade at the time that this story took place. Now, Sarah had a significant disability. She wasn't able to speak, and she used a wheelchair. She was learning how slowly to use an alternative communication device, but really hadn't mastered it yet. So the school organized an Iep meeting trying to figure out how they might best support Sarah in the regular classroom. So Laura was involved in this, and they were inviting all sorts of people who might be interested and have insights on what Sarah might need. One of the little boys who really wanted an invitation to this particular meeting was one of Sarah's friends, who also had the dubious distinction of being considered one of the most behaviorally difficult students in the school. Now, Laura had had some concerns about this friendship, but her older children, Sarah's siblings, had watched the relationship in the school and said, you know, Mom, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is a good relationship. So, despite her qualms, she invited this little boy. So they were sitting around and they were discussing Sarah's communication, of which she had relatively little. And so people were concerned about this. And they were saying, well, you know, she really doesn't have a way to tell us much of anything. All of a sudden, this little boy sprung up on his feet, all 4 feet whatever of him, and said, that's not true, is it, Sarah? And Sarah did something that sounded suspiciously like confirmation. She went, And he said, now, When Sarah wants to go outside, this is how she tells me. When she's hungry, this is how I know. When she wants to use the washroom, this is how I know. And he went through this long laundry list of things. And the whole time Sarah's looking at him and going, Now Laura said it was kind of embarrassing to be upstaged by an 8-year-old, but there it was. So this little boy at the end of this whole thing stood up again, looked around the room and said, well, I didn't just come for the juice and cookies, you know. Now, when we tell this story and others like it, we do have a caveat. One of the things that disabled students often tell us is that it's easier to be ignored than it is to be considered the class project. So when we're doing this, we need to be really careful that we don't in some way stigmatize the child in the process, right? We want to make sure that that friendship and the equity in that friendship is preserved, but at the same time, utilize the perspective that kids bring to things, because they'll often see things that we don't. So the next point is, again, teachers who are including students with disabilities. We have huge resources in each other. And sometimes those resources are in our own districts, in our own schools, and sometimes they're outside our districts and in other schools. But if we look around, we can find them, and those people can be inordinately valuable. So other resources we might look at are other staff. For example, the principal, the custodian, the librarian. Any one of these people may have insights. And yeah, I did say custodian, and that's because of a story that I want to tell you now. And this came to us from our friend Chris, who was an itinerant inclusion specialist in a school district in the Midwest. And Chris was called into a school where they were really struggling to support a young man, and nothing that they'd done up to that point was really working. So Chris came in and did what he usually does, which was ask the student, how are things going? How might we best support you? All of those questions that Norm talked about earlier. But he was getting absolutely nowhere. This young man either was unable or unwilling to say. So his next step was to go to the principal and the other teachers and say, you know, what's going on here? And the most important question that he likes to ask is, so who likes this kid? He wants to find the person who has a relationship with this kid. And much to their consternation, the teachers and the principal realized that there were very few people in the school who really liked this kid. He posed a lot of challenges to all of them. But after some head scratching and thinking, the principal says, well, you know, I have seen him hanging out with the custodian. So Chris said, great, I'll be right back. So he went down to the basement, to the custodian's office, and he said, I've heard that you've been spending a bit of time with Derek, and I know he's having a lot of trouble in school. Can you give me your perspective on this? And the custodian said, well, finally. And then he went through an entire litany of all the things from Derek's point of view. So at the end of this, Chris went back up to the principal's office and says, I have some ideas for your in-service. And the principal pulled out his date book. This was in the days of date books. And said, okay, well, let's see when you and I both have some free time. Chris said, no, you don't understand. I'm not doing your in-service. Your custodian is. And that's exactly how it happened.
All right. So one of the most important resources the teachers told us they really appreciated was school-based problem-solving teams, or what are sometimes called teacher assistant teams, TATs. A school in Kitchener, for example, would have the first half hour of every day where a small team would come together and do problem solving around the kids with disability. The interesting thing was, even when they had many of the problems solved for the disabled students, this problem solving team continued for other students in the school who were not necessarily identified as having special needs. So just having that resource, the team of people who can come together and help a teacher solve problems. Now obviously, there are other inclusive schools either within your district or other districts. The next resource is substitute time. We have a friendly colleague, Larry Wells, who is the special ed director of Victoria's School District, and he said the biggest bang for his buck was to hire a substitute for half a day and give that teacher half a day of planning time to either do individual planning or to meet with family or other professionals. Teachers were enormously appreciative of this time just to accomplish what they wanted to do but never could find the time to do it. And finally, the most obvious is the internet listservs, etc. The fifth area that teachers identified that was important for support was classroom assistants. Now, the first thing that teachers said was only if necessary. Very often when we have a disabled kid in our class, the automatic go-to is we need a full-time aide with this kid throughout the day. And that often preempts more creative problem solving. So let me give you an example of this. When I went to regular high school, I had to figure out a way how to take notes. Now, the special ed director wanted to hire an educational assistant to take notes for me. But I didn't want someone hanging over my shoulder because I was afraid it would stigmatize me. So what I figured out eventually was I walked around to all my classes with a pack of carbon paper. I gave a piece of carbon paper to the kid who took the most copious notes in the class. And at the end of the class, I would have a perfect set of notes. So very often we need to be creative. And that's what one principal called the October rule. He said, try, it's not always possible, but try not to hire a classroom aide until October, because that almost forces you to find more creative and less stigmatizing ways of providing support for a disabled student in the regular class.
Another important thing is making sure that the teacher maintains ownership of the student. In other words, it's not like the teacher has 26 students and the teacher aide has 1 student, but the teacher is responsible for all the students. So let's look at the what of having a classroom assistant. So again, have the person be a classroom assistant, not a student aide. That works to ensure that we don't have any stigmatization, and it also works to ensure that we're able to support the kids that haven't been identified. And I think all teachers know, certainly we heard this, that there's always students in the class who have not been identified and don't have any funding following them that still require extra support. And if we're using this person as a classroom assistant rather than someone appendage to the disabled child, then we're free to deploy them wherever we need them. Again, this avoids a codependent symbiotic relationship, and we believe that that should be discussed during hiring and during IEP meetings and during supervision. We tend to hire nurturing and supportive people, and that's all very well and good, but sometimes you'll come into a classroom by January and you'll wonder to yourself who actually needs who the most. And again, we've got to really make sure that we don't inadvertently support learned helplessness. We believe that the classroom assistant should collaborate and participate in the planning, and that doesn't always happen. In the best situations we've seen, it does happen. And those people often have a lot to contribute, and they shouldn't be overlooked. So again, we want to make sure that the classroom assistant is working through the other students and then retreats when the other students become involved. We've heard too often from students who have come through school with classroom assistants that it wasn't always helpful. And one of the things that really became a problem was that it interfered with the development of friendships. In an interesting piece of research done by Michael Giangreco and Mary Beth Doyle, they found that in elementary school and middle school, if kids approached the disabled student with overtures of friendship and the classroom assistant was there, they would retreat. If the classroom assistant retreated, they would come back. However, in high school, if they came to the student and the classroom assistant was there, they would retreat, but they wouldn't come back. So we need to be really, really careful that we're not inadvertently destroying the chances for that child to make friends. So it's important that the classroom assistant becomes aware of deliberately and intentionally utilizing the other students and encouraging them to get involved, encouraging them to work with the disabled student. Okay, providing physical assistance. Again, work towards student independence. Try to avoid that tendency towards learned helplessness and to really make that intentional as well, a gradual planned withdrawal. Because we know that when students leave school, they probably won't have that kind of support. So we want to make sure that we've encouraged as much independence as possible. The WHO. Age and sex appropriate wherever possible. It isn't always possible, especially for younger kids. Darn those child labor laws. But again, as close as possible. We've seen some really wonderful situations where college-age students are working with teenage students, and that works really well. And again, hiring based on values and not necessarily just on credentials.
The final area is administrative support. As we said at the beginning, we're not going to go through this because this slide is self-explanatory.
So what we'd like to do now, in conclusion, is just to leave you with some points to remember.
Remember, information about the child is more helpful than information about the disability. Disability spreads over the person, leading people to make assumptions about who the person is and what their life is like. You can never have expertise on a child because expertise is based on generalizations of the disability. Experience is based on the specific information about the child.
So remember to collaborate. Pantries are more useful than recipes. And what's the dream for this child? Remember, being realistic isn't necessarily realistic. Like Socrates, know that you don't know. Create runaway lanes, set up crisis procedures. Trying to understand someone's behavior outside the context of their life is fundamentally disrespectful. And don't assume a malicious intent, just stay curious. Remember that the disability can't be cured. Focus on functional skills, not developmental skills. So we'd like to leave the last word to the Canadian playwright Michel Tremblay, who once said, "If we can look at others with curiosity rather than judgment, then we will discover the tenderness within ourselves."
So we hope this presentation has been useful and helpful.
And good luck to all of you. So as our public health director, Bonnie Henry in British Columbia says, be kind, be calm, and be safe. Best of luck to all of you.
Bye.
Bye.